Imagine 684 people dying in a single explosion, and the entire world never finding out. No news report, no official statement, no memorial, just silence. That is exactly what happened deep beneath the hills of Shanxi Province, China, on May 9th, 1960. The Laobaidong coal mine swallowed hundreds of men whole, and the Chinese government buried not just the bodies, but the truth itself for over 3 decades. This wasn't an accident that slipped through the cracks of history. It was deliberately erased. While other nations mourned their mining disasters publicly, Chinese citizens were kept completely in the dark. Families waited. Workers descended into the same dangerous tunnels the very next day, and the state moved on, as if 684 human lives had simply never existed. It wasn't until 1992, 32 years later, that the full scale of the catastrophe was finally acknowledged. So what really happened on that morning in 1960? Why did China's most powerful institution choose silence over truth? And who were the men who never came home? Stay with us. This is the story they tried to erase from history. And it deserved. The Laobaidong coal mine sat near Datong City in Shanxi Province, a region that had been the heartbeat of China's coal industry for centuries. The mountains here held some of the richest coal deposits in all of Asia, and by the late 1950s, Datong had become one of the most strategically important industrial zones in the entire country. But in 1958, everything changed. Chairman Mao Zedong launched what he called the Great Leap Forward, an aggressive campaign to transform China from a rural farming nation into a modern industrial superpower within just a few years. The slogan echoed through every factory and mine: more, faster, better, cheaper. Laobaidong was ordered to deliver, and deliver it did, but at a terrible cost. By 1960, the mine had pushed its daily coal output to 50% above its recommended safe capacity. That means every single day, the tunnels were carrying more weight, more workers, more machinery, and far more toxic methane gas than the infrastructure was ever designed to handle. The ventilation systems, already aging and underpowered, were completely overwhelmed. Engineers on site likely knew the risk. But in an era where failing to meet state production quotas could mean imprisonment, nobody dared slow down. The mine wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a pressure cooker, and the fuse had already been lit. May 9th, 1960. Morning shift change. This was the most crowded moment of any mining day. Hundreds of exhausted workers making their way up through the shafts while the fresh day shift descended in the opposite direction. Narrow tunnels packed with men, tools, and coal carts, the air thick and warm. Deep in the lower galleries, methane gas had been silently accumulating for hours, possibly days. The ventilation system, strained far beyond capacity by months of overproduction, simply could not flush it out fast enough. Then came the spark. Nobody knows exactly what ignited it. A faulty cable, the friction of a metal cart, a damaged lamp. It didn't matter. In a tunnel where methane had reached explosive concentration, even a single static discharge was enough. The blast traveled through the shaft network at terrifying speed. Roof supports collapsed in sequence. The force of the shockwave threw men off their feet hundreds of meters away. The elevator cage was reportedly hurled 15 meters into the air by the pressure wave. On the surface, thick black smoke erupted from every ventilation shaft simultaneously. People standing near the entrance were knocked down by the concussive force. Inside the tunnels, for most men, there was no escape. The explosion was not just one event. It triggered a chain reaction of collapses, fires, and carbon monoxide flooding that turned the entire mine into a sealed tomb. In less than a minute, 684 people were gone. Within hours of the explosion, something extraordinary happened. Not a rescue operation, but a systematic effort to control information. Local Communist Party officials, understanding immediately that a disaster of this magnitude would reflect badly on the Great Leap Forward, moved quickly to contain the story. Miners' families gathered at the pithead were dispersed. Workers from other departments were ordered to say nothing. The mine entrance was sealed off with guards. No state media outlet ran the story. Radio stations were silent. Newspapers, all of which were state-controlled, published not a single word about the hundreds of men who had just died beneath Shanxi's soil. This was not negligence. This was a deliberate, coordinated erasure. The Great Leap Forward was already a catastrophe in human terms. Historians now estimate it caused between 15 and 55 million deaths through famine and forced labor. Admitting that one of the flagship industrial projects had just killed 684 miners in a single day would have been politically devastating. So the families of the dead were given basic compensation and quietly told to move on. The workers were replaced, production targets were revised, and the Laobaidong disaster was officially classified, sealed away in party archives, where it would remain untouched for 3 decades. It wasn't a cover-up born of shame alone. It was a cover-up born of cold, calculated political survival. For the wives, children, and parents of the 684 men who died at Laobaidong, the aftermath was something almost impossible to describe. There was no official death notice, no state funeral, no public acknowledgement that their fathers, husbands, and sons had given their lives. Families were told, in vague terms, that their loved ones had died in a work accident, and then essentially told to be quiet about it. In Chinese culture, the ability to properly mourn the dead, to hold ceremonies, to mark graves, to speak the names of the lost, is not merely a tradition. It is a fundamental duty to the deceased. The denial of that ritual created wounds that would last generations. Some families didn't fully understand the scale of what had happened for years. Information was so tightly controlled at the local level that some widows were reportedly told their husbands had died in separate, unrelated incidents. The scale of the collective loss deliberately hidden even from those most affected. Children grew up knowing their fathers were gone, but not why, and not alongside whom. There was no community of shared grief, because the community itself had been forbidden from grieving together. This was one of the most devastating aspects of the cover-up. Not just that the truth was hidden from the world, but that it was hidden from the people who needed it most. The living were denied the right to properly honor the dead. To truly understand Laobaidong, you have to understand the world that created it. When Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward in 1958, China was a nation desperate to prove itself on the global stage. The Soviet Union had recently launched Sputnik. Western industrial powers dominated global trade. Mao believed China could overtake Britain in steel production within 15 years, and he was willing to pay any price to prove it. The entire national economy was reorganized around impossible production targets. Local party officials who failed to meet their quotas risked being labeled counter-revolutionaries, a label that could mean imprisonment or worse. So instead of reporting honest numbers, they inflated them. And instead of admitting limits, they pushed workers harder. In the mines of Shanxi, this translated into a very specific kind of danger. Ventilation maintenance was deferred to maximize working hours. Safety inspections were either skipped or falsified. Workers were pushed into tunnels that engineers knew were dangerously gas-rich. Equipment was run until it broke, then patched together and run again. The Laobaidong disaster was not an anomaly within this system. It was the system working exactly as designed, prioritizing output over human life, and then burying the consequences. Historians who have studied the period note that multiple mine disasters occurred during this era, most of which were never officially reported. Laobaidong was simply the largest, and eventually the one that could no longer stay completely hidden. For 32 years, the Laobaidong disaster existed only in the memories of survivors, the grief of families, and the sealed files of the Communist Party. Then, in 1992, something shifted. China, in the early 1990s, was a very different country from the one that had silenced Laobaidong in 1960. The reform era under Deng Xiaoping had loosened, slightly, the stranglehold on public information. Investigative journalism, still constrained but more alive than before, began pushing at the boundaries of what could be reported. Researchers and journalists who had been quietly gathering testimony from survivors and retired officials finally found a window to publish. The details that emerged were staggering, not just the death toll, 684 confirmed dead, but the systematic nature of the suppression that followed. The files, the ordered silence, the families told to ask no questions. The revelation did not trigger a major national reckoning. There was no formal apology from the government. No national memorial was established. No officials were prosecuted for the cover-up. But the story was out. The name Laobaidong was spoken publicly for the first time. Historians began incorporating it into their work on industrial disasters and the Great Leap Forward. Families who had lived with unacknowledged loss for 3 decades finally had their grief validated by the historical record. It was a partial justice, imperfect, delayed, and incomplete. But it was something. The silence had finally broken. To understand why mine explosions are so catastrophically lethal, you need to understand the chemistry that makes them nearly impossible to survive. Methane, chemical formula CH4, is a colorless, odorless gas that forms naturally as coal decomposes underground. In small concentrations, it's simply a nuisance. But when methane accumulates to between 5% and 15% of the air in a confined space, it becomes explosive. That range is called the explosive limit. And in an enclosed tunnel with poor ventilation, reaching it is not a question of if, but when. At Laobaidong, the ventilation system had been designed for a specific operational capacity. When production was pushed 50% beyond that limit, the airflow became completely inadequate to dilute the methane seeping from the coal seams. The gas built up silently in the lower galleries, invisible, undetectable without proper equipment, and utterly lethal. When the explosion occurred, it did not simply kill through blast force. The pressure wave collapsed tunnel supports, sealing off escape routes. The heat ignited coal dust suspended in the air, creating secondary explosions. And most deadly of all, the explosion consumed the available oxygen and replaced it with carbon monoxide, the colorless killer gas that suffocates miners before they even realize something is wrong. Men who survived the initial blast often died within minutes from CO poisoning. There was no time for rescue, no chance for retreat. The physics of the disaster made survival almost mathematically impossible for anyone in the affected zones. China's coal mining industry has always been one of the most dangerous on Earth. Even today, with vastly improved technology and stricter regulations, Chinese mines account for a disproportionate share of global mining fatalities. But the trajectory of that safety record and the disasters that forced change along the way runs directly through events like Laobaidong. The acknowledgment of the 1960 disaster in 1992 came at a moment when China's coal industry was again under intense scrutiny. The post-reform era had brought private mine ownership, which introduced new profit pressures. and with them, new safety shortcuts. Disasters in the 1990s and 2000s, though smaller than Laobaidong, became increasingly difficult to suppress in an era of mobile phones and internet connectivity. Each disaster forced a legislative response. China enacted major mine safety laws in 1992, 2002, and again following high-profile incidents in the 2000s. The government began shutting down small, unregulated private mines by the thousands. Methane monitoring technology was modernized. Penalties for safety violations were dramatically increased. But critics, including Chinese engineers and international safety organizations, have consistently argued that enforcement remains the central problem. Regulations exist on paper. Implementation varies wildly by region and by the political will of local officials. Laobaidong's true legacy, then, is not comfort. It is a warning about what happens when production targets override human safety, when institutional silence replaces accountability, when the state decides that truth is inconvenient. 684. That number deserves to be said slowly, because behind every single digit is a face, a family, a life that was cut short beneath the coal-black earth of Shanxi Province on a May morning in 1960. These were not soldiers who chose to risk their lives. They were workers, miners doing the only job available to them in a system that gave them no voice, no choice, and ultimately, no protection. They descended into those tunnels because the state required it of them. And when the tunnels became their graves, the state chose to look away. The Laobaidong disaster holds a mirror up to something deeply uncomfortable, not just about China's past, but about the relationship between power and truth in any society. When governments decide that maintaining an image matters more than acknowledging loss, the victims are harmed twice, once by the disaster itself, and again by the erasure. For over 3 decades, the men of Laobaidong had no memorial, no public acknowledgment. Their names were not read aloud. Their families had no collective space to grieve. This video exists because those 684 lives matter. Because history that is buried, whether under coal or under silence, has a way of repeating itself. If you stayed until the end of this story, share it. Not for an algorithm, but because 684 people spent 32 years waiting for someone to simply say, "We remember you."